The FBI usually goes after the world's most dangerous criminals, but in 2006, they had an unusual target on their radar, a 16-year-old kid. However, this wasn't just any teenager. He was one of the best hackers in the country. But here's the crazy part. This brilliant hacker was blind. So how does someone who can't see rise to the top of the hacking world and end up wanted by the FBI? This is the story of how a blind kid became an FBI wanted hacker. I'm visualventure, and you are awesome. A dark past. Matthew Wegman didn't just dislike his childhood, he hated it. Matthew was born blind because of a condition called optic nerve atrophy. This happens when the optic nerve, which connects the eyes to the brain, gets damaged and can't send signals properly. Unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be a cure for this condition. For Matthew, this meant his eyes didn't function properly and likely never would. But as tough as that was, his blindness wasn't the only thing that made life hard. When Matthew was just 5, his father abandoned the family. His mom was left to hold everything together, struggling to pay the bills with her job as a nurse. For Matthew, every day was a reminder of how unfair life was. But somehow, things got even worse as he got older. Matthew grew up in a tough neighborhood in East Boston, surrounded by kids who constantly picked on him. It didn't help that he walked around with a cane and his eyes always rolled around uncontrollably. Kids always teased Matthew, but they had no idea that their mean jokes would eventually push Matthew into a life of crime. The bullying lit a fire in Matthew. He made up his mind to do 2 things. First, he wanted to live like his blindness didn't hold him back, to prove to himself and everyone else that he could do anything people with sight could. Second, he wanted to become so powerful that no one would ever dare to bully him again. It wasn't long before Matthew got the chance to tackle his first goal, living as though his blindness didn't matter. Although he couldn't see clearly, Matthew realized he could sense blurry shapes, and he exploited the ability for all it was worth. When he was 8, he learned how to ride a bike using the blurry shadows for guidance. Then he convinced his stepdad to let him drive a car around an empty parking lot. He even started cooking his own meals by feeling his way around the kitchen. Matthew said those things made him feel a lot better because he was doing something that people who see can do. Then Matthew shifted his focus to his second goal, to become so powerful that he would never be bullied again. But chasing that dream would lead him down a dark path and put him on the FBI's radar. Matthew had a superpower, and this isn't a figure of speech. Although Matthew couldn't see, he could hear much better than the average person. If someone nearby was talking on the phone, Matthew could hear both sides of the conversation, like the phone was in his own hand. He could also remember any sound he heard and replicate it perfectly. This meant he could mimic voices so well that he could sound like an adult or even a female. By the age of 10, Matthew was pushing himself to see what he could do with his skills. He started by mimicking characters he heard on Cartoon Network and became obsessed with voices, music, and sounds of all sorts. Soon, he figured out that using the telephone was a great way to practice. This was around the year 2000, when most homes still used landline phones like these. As Matthew experimented with his home phone, he realized he could memorize phone numbers by the sounds of the buttons. Each number made a unique sound, and he memorized all of them. He dialed random numbers just to see who would pick up and how they would react. By the time he was 11, Matthew's ability to hear things far away, remember sounds, and mimic voices reached extraordinary levels. He knew the skill could give him the power he craved, and he was waiting for the perfect opportunity to use it. Then in 2001, he got his chance. Around this time, Matthew was 11. He was, quote, a blind, little tubby bald kid in a broke family. And because of that, he spent most of his time alone in his room. One day, a classmate who felt sorry for Matthew handed him a phone number. He told Matthew to call that number whenever he got lonely. It was a number for a telephone party line called Studio 55. Most people today don't know what a party line is, but back in the late 90s and early 2000s, party lines were insanely popular.
These people, like thousands of others throughout the country, have joined the party. The party line. It's one of the easiest and most enjoyable ways to meet new people.
Party lines were like phone versions of internet chat rooms. A bunch of people would call in and talk at the same time at like a conference call.
Just pick up the phone and call 1-809-544-CHAT. There's a party waiting for you. It's the party line. Talk with a new group of friends 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
The moment Matthew dialed into the party line, his loneliness disappeared. There were so many voices. Some were talking to each other. Others piped in only occasionally, listening in as they watched TV or played video games.
Would you stay on these party lines for hours and like people would come and go and it would be sort of like a chat room?
To most people, it would have been a chaotic mess of overlapping sounds. But Matthew could hear each voice and every detail, no matter how faint. This was the perfect place to deploy his superpower. Whenever he was on the phone, Matthew wasn't a shy blind kid from East Boston. He became someone completely different, outspoken, quick-witted, and even a little mean. Matthew spent hours on the party lines, chatting, switching between voices, and just having fun. But what he loved most was flirting with the girls on the line. In real life, talking to girls was hard for him, but on the phone, he had all the confidence in the world. Then, one bad encounter with a girl on the party line ruined everything. That girl made Matthew so mad that he committed his first crime, marking the start of his criminal journey. The question is, what happened to make him snap? A villain is born. The trouble started when Matthew was just 14, but then he spent 3 years and thousands of hours on the party lines, and his ego was massive. He thought he could say anything on there. During one call, Matthew got into an argument with an 18-year-old girl named Danielle. Here's how it started. Matthew liked Danielle and wanted to flirt with her, but Danielle wasn't interested, not even a little bit. She shut him down right away. Danielle's rejection hit Matthew hard. First, he felt embarrassed, and then it turned into anger and eventually rage. He took it personally, seeing Danielle as one of the mean kids who bullied him when he was younger. He decided she needed to pay, and he already had a plan. Matthew's first step was to find Danielle's home phone number. Once he had it, he learned a skill called caller ID spoofing. Spoofing is a way to make a phone call look like it's coming from a different phone number. In this case, Matthew used spoofing so that when he called someone, it would show Danielle's number on the caller ID screen of the person he phoned, as if the call was coming from Danielle's phone when it was actually coming from his. Technically, spoofing is illegal, but it was nothing compared to what Matthew was going to do next. With everything set, Matthew called 911 and rigged the caller ID so it looked like the call was coming from Danielle's house. When the operator answered, Matthew disguised his voice. He tried to sound like an unstable, angry old man. Matthew said his name was John Defano. He claimed he was inside Danielle's house holding her and her father hostage. He went on to make multiple threats and ended by challenging the police. He screamed, "I'm not talking anymore. You have the address. If I don't have help here now in the next 5 minutes, I swear I will blank these people." Then he hung up. SWAT officers stormed Danielle's house, preparing for the worst. Inside, Danielle and her dad were just going about their day, completely unaware of what was coming. Suddenly, the SWAT team burst in, weapons drawn, shouting commands as they searched for a supposed threat. The whole scene was pure chaos. Luckily, no one got hurt, but it was a traumatic experience for the family. What Matthew did was called swatting. Swatting is a cruel prank where someone tricks the police into sending a SWAT team to an innocent person's home, and it's as dangerous as it sounds. In Tennessee, a man lost his life because of a swatting incident gone horribly wrong. Of course, swatting is a serious crime, and many people have been sent to prison for doing it. In one case, a man got 20 years behind bars. Back at Danielle's house, she and her dad were still in shock. Meanwhile, blind Matthew was in his room feeling unstoppable. He saw swatting as a way to get revenge on anyone who crossed him. All it took was one call to 911 and a little voice acting, and he could cause chaos without ever leaving his room. Unfortunately, Danielle wasn't the only name on Matthew's hit list. He was just getting started. Matthew spent hours each day on party lines, trash talking and picking fights. When someone on the line would challenge him or piss him off, he would respond by faking a 911 call and sending an armed SWAT team to their door. Matthew swatted his enemies as many as 60 different times. The more time he spent on party lines, the more extreme he became. Before Matthew turned 15, he discovered a new skill to help him cause more chaos. It was called phreaking.
Phone phreaking was learning how to use a technology, how to penetrate and utilize and expand the technology in ways that weren't generally available to the general public.
Freaks are hackers, except they don't hack computers, they hack telephones. Phreaking started as a way to save money on calls.
Freaks use technical expertise and guile to make free phone calls.
But eventually, these phone hackers or freaks started doing much more damage. They would reroute numbers so calls go to the wrong place, eavesdrop on private calls, and even shut down someone's phone service completely.
Freaks are criminals, fraudsters, freeloaders. They're engaged in a war against the giant international phone companies.
To put it simply, freaks can cause a surprising amount of harm with a phone. One freak went as far as hacking the voicemail of the Department of Homeland Security. Of course, freaking is illegal and considered a cybercrime, but Matthew didn't care. Freaking made him more powerful, so he decided to become a master at it. As part of his training, Matthew studied the telephone system obsessively. Every tone, click, and beep became second nature to him. Soon, if he heard someone dialing a number, he could memorize the digits purely by tone. But he didn't stop there. Matthew pushed his skills even further by mastering social engineering. Social engineering is basically manipulating people into giving away private information like passwords and access codes. It's like being a con artist but over the phone.
But hackers can be very socially smart. They can call up a company and convince the company to give them details they normally wouldn't do.
Matthew would call companies like AT&T and Verizon pretending to be an employee and trick them into giving up sensitive information. If he heard a supervisor's voice once, he could imitate it flawlessly to trick other employees into doing what he wanted. As Matthew got better at freaking, he found more creative ways to break the law. He would wiretap Sprint customers to listen in on credit card transactions. Once he obtained the numbers, he would buy things using the victim's credit card. When he didn't have access to a real card, he could somehow bill purchases to bogus credit cards, snagging everything from free phone service to Dunkin' Donuts gift cards. He even hacked and called the cell phones of Lindsay Lohan and Eminem. This guy was a hacking genius. As Matthew's skills grew sharper, his patience wore thinner. The smallest hint of disrespect could set him off in an instant. People on the party lines quickly learned to tread carefully around him. One person even said that he was feared by grown men and women because he was ruthless. Another described him as crazy enough to do anything. By 2005, Matthew achieved his goal. He was considered one of the best phone hackers among phone party line groups. And as a twisted reward for his efforts, he was invited to join a notorious gang of phone hackers known as the Wrecking Crew. Together, they would take his talents and his destruction to the next level. The Wrecking Crew. Alright, so we know how destructive Matthew was with a phone, but what's even scarier is what hackers can do with a computer. Every time we go online, we leave digital footprints, traces of our personal information. And in today's world, this can be especially dangerous, which is why Proton exists. Proton is an encrypted software platform built around one goal: protecting your privacy. They offer tools like Proton Mail, which gives you a secure email address that's protected with end-to-end encryption. No one else, not even Proton, can read your emails. Proton is also open source, which shows absolute transparency. So I get a ton of spam emails every day just like you. Well, Proton has this thing called Hide My Email, where you can create aliases when you sign up for new websites to hide your real email address. And if you're like, man, switching email providers would be a headache, well, Proton allows you to migrate your existing email with just a couple of clicks using their easy switch tool. Lastly, I know a lot of people who swear by Proton because these guys are still the most secure email platform to date. To sign up, go to proton.me/visualventure or click my link below to get up to 40% off Proton Mail. Thank you a ton, Proton, for sponsoring this video. The Wrecking Crew was Matthew's new gang and was involved in dozens of illegal activities.
They break into the system by manipulating free phone numbers. They squat in people's voicemail boxes. Using computers, they conjure up fake account numbers and credit card numbers, or acquire the numbers using dubious methods.
But for Matthew Wegman, joining this gang of phone hackers was like finding a family. He wasn't just a kid alone in his room anymore, he was part of a team that admired his skills and gave him a taste of real power. At the center of it all was Stuart Rosoff, Matthew's mentor in crime. Stuart was a ruthless middle-aged man who already spent 3 years in prison. Stuart Stuart didn't care about silly pranks. He did things that could ruin lives. For instance, Stuart called 911 on a woman who annoyed him. He told the dispatcher she was hurting her kids. That was all it took. Within minutes, the police were at her door ready to take her children away. But Stuart didn't stop there. When Child Protective Services started investigating the woman, Stuart called her to gloat, bragging that he could destroy her life anytime he wanted to. Stuart taught Matthew that true power came from being heartless. And Matthew, who was just 15 years old, believed him. Matthew adopted the nickname Lil Hacker, and with his incredible hearing and knack for impersonation, he quickly became the most skilled member of the wrecking crew. But while Matthew was making a name for himself, someone else was watching him closely. On the party lines, a 37-year-old man named Jeff Daniels wanted to get close to Matthew. Jeff Daniels was arrested for hacking as a teenager, but he turned his life around. He saw Matthew as a younger version of himself, and he didn't want Matthew to make the same mistakes he did. Daniels made it his mission to pull Matthew out of the hacking gang before it was too late. But Matthew wasn't having it. He didn't like Jeff Daniels giving him advice or sticking his nose where it didn't belong. The two clashed, and when Daniel didn't back off, Matthew decided to scare him off. Matthew tracked down where Daniels lived. Then he found the phone number of Daniels' landlord. With a single phone call, Matthew tried to ruin Daniels' life. Matthew called the landlord and told him that Daniels was a pervert and a murderer, trying to get him evicted. But when the landlord told Daniels about the shocking claims, Daniel instantly knew who was behind it: Matthew. But instead of retaliating in anger, Daniels did something that finally got through to Matthew. Daniels tracked down the teenager's detailed personal information, including his social security number. It was a warning, a way of saying, "I'm smarter than you. I can beat you at your own game." And it worked. Matthew was impressed by Daniel's skills. For the first time ever, Matthew started to listen. The two began talking for hours on the phone at night. One night, something broke inside Matthew. He opened up about his miserable and impoverished life, crying as he told Daniels how much he longed to see the world with his own eyes. Daniel encouraged him to leave his life of crime behind because breaking the law wasn't going to make things better. Matthew took his advice to heart. He changed his party line nickname from Lil Hacker to Silence, a symbol of his attempt to turn things around. He even met a girl named Chastity on a party line, and they began a long-distance relationship. For the first time in a long time, it seemed like Matthew was on the right path. But the pull of his old life was too strong. He missed the power he once had and the way people feared him because of his ruthlessness. Most importantly, he loved being part of the wrecking crew gang. Matthew was torn between two lives. Then, one incident on the party line unraveled all the progress Matthew made. At just 16, Matthew got into an argument with a 28-year-old girl named Stephanie Prue. He lashed out and told her, "You're annoying. I might come after you." But instead of begging for mercy, Stephanie brushed him off like he was nothing, daring him to take action. Her defiance set something off in Matthew. He wanted to prove to Stephanie and everyone else that he wasn't someone to mess with. The wrong target. After arguing with Matthew on the party line, Stephanie Prue went back to her normal life, but she never forgot his threat to come after her. Days turned into weeks and nothing happened. Eventually, Stephanie started to think it was all talk, that Matthew was just bluffing. She was wrong. Matthew wasn't bluffing, he was waiting. For his plan to work, it needed to be a surprise. Eventually, Matthew made his move, but instead of targeting Stephanie, he went after her 60-year-old father. It was 1 a.m. on June 12, 2006. Matthew sat in his bedroom and called 911. Using caller ID spoofing, he made it look like the call was coming from a house in Alvarado, Texas. When the operator answered, Matthew changed his voice to sound like an angry old man. He identified himself as Jim Prue, Stephanie's dad, and said he was high on substances. Then came the real bombshell. He claimed he was armed and was holding someone hostage in his trailer. He demanded $50,000 so he could flee to Mexico. But he also warned that if any cops got in his way, he would retaliate. Then Matthew ended the call, leaving the operator no choice but to send a SWAT team once again to the scene. With one call, he turned Stephanie's father into a marked man. At that very moment, Jim Jim Prue was at home in his trailer, completely unaware of the storm heading his way. Stepping outside to grab something, he spotted shadows moving toward him. Before he could react, he was surrounded by SWAT officers with weapons aimed at him. The officers threw Prue on the ground, snapped handcuffs on him, and put him in the back of a squad car. One wrong move and the situation could have ended in tragedy. Once the SWAT team searched the trailer, they found no hostages, no weapons, and no danger. When Stephanie heard what happened to her dad, she knew Matthew was behind it. She figured this swatting incident was the end of Matthew's revenge, but it wasn't. It was only the beginning. Matthew wasn't the only hacker who disliked Stephanie. Other freakers on the phone lines couldn't stand her either. After Matthew's stunt, the group rallied against Stephanie. They harassed her relentlessly, prank calling, sending pizzas she didn't order, and cutting her phone lines. They even offered a $300 prize to whoever could pull another swatting against Stephanie or her family. Months later, the police received a 911 call from Stephanie's apartment begging them to come save her. But when they arrived, they realized there was no emergency. It was just another prank. That's when Stephanie told the officers about the party line, the harassment, and the power the freakers had to manipulate calls. She painted the freakers as a network of dangerous criminals using phones as weapons to cause chaos. The local police knew they were in over their heads. They couldn't stop this alone. So the Fort Worth police called the Dallas branch of the FBI for help. These phone hackers were about to go head-to-head with the FBI. A visit from the FBI. The FBI assigned one of their best, Special Agent Alan Lind, to figure out what was going on. He was one of the most experienced in the FBI Dallas Cyber Squad. He spent the last 10 years taking down hackers and freakers who thought they were untouchable. But going after the Wrecking Crew would be so much easier because he had help. Stephanie Prue was still mad that Matthew and his friends called 911 on her dad. She was itching for revenge. So when the FBI contacted Stephanie, she didn't hold back. She told them about the Wrecking Crew, named the people involved, and explained how they hacked phones and broke the law. Thanks to Stephanie's information, the FBI quickly closed in on the Wrecking Crew. But one name stood out above all the rest: the blind kid Matthew Wakeman. In December 2006, Matthew walked into his house and froze. He heard a different voice in the house. Sitting there with his mom was FBI Special Agent Alan Lind. The FBI agent laid out everything he knew about Matthew's crimes: stealing credit cards, impersonating police officers, and making 911 calls that sent SWAT teams to people's homes. These were serious crimes. Swatting alone could land Matthew in jail for 5 to 20 years. Agent Lind made it clear that the FBI was shutting down the Wrecking Crew and throwing them all in jail. But they had an offer for Matthew. Since Matthew was a minor, the FBI would cut him a deal. If he cooperated with law enforcement during their investigation, he could avoid jail time. Matthew's mom begged him to take the deal. She couldn't imagine her blind, shy son locked up behind bars. Matthew agreed to cooperate. He confessed his role in the phone assaults and promised to stop breaking the law. But promises are easy to make and hard to keep. Without the thrill of hacking phones and breaking the law, Matthew felt like a nobody, just a blind kid that no one respected. And Matthew obviously didn't want to be a nobody. Within days of agreeing to cooperate, he was back on the party line committing his crimes again. As the FBI started arresting other members of the Wrecking Crew, everyone realized the game was over. This was a good time to get off the party line to lay low. But while most people were backing off, Matthew was still doubling down on his illegal activities. He couldn't go 3 days without attempting a hack of some sort. Around that time, recordings and details of Matthew's fake 911 calls leaked and spread online. Suddenly, thousands of people heard how perfectly Matthew could impersonate anyone and manipulate people over the phone. His reputation exploded overnight. In the hacking world, he was a legend. Matthew loved his newfound fame, and he decided once and for all that he was never giving up this life no matter the cost. Matthew wanted to keep breaking the law, but he didn't want to go to jail. So he started a campaign of intimidation, warning his victims that any cooperation with investigators would warrant new attacks. And he meant it. When he found out a woman in Virginia talked to the FBI about him, he went after her mother, trying to make her look like a criminal. jail. He warned another person that if she gave his name to investigators, he would put her husband out of business. But no matter how hard he tried to scare people, it wasn't enough to save the wrecking crew. In 2007, the members of the crew pleaded guilty to swatting and other hacking-related crimes. One of them told the judge, "I'm kinda like a nobody in real life. I was actually somebody on the phone, somebody important." Matthew watched as his friends were sent to jail for about 5 years each. He was the only one the FBI let off the hook because he was a minor. All he had to do was walk away before April 20th, 2008, which was the day he would turn 18. After that, any crime he committed would get him tried as an adult. But as his 18th birthday approached, Matthew still couldn't let go. And what he was about to do was something that would give him no way out. The last straw. Matthew Wegman turned 18 in April 2008. Now, the stakes were even higher than ever. One slip and he'd face adult charges. But thanks to his campaign of intimidation, everyone knew the rules. Mention his name to the FBI and you'll become his next target. Matthew's scare tactics worked on almost everyone. But one man refused to back down. His name was Billy Smith. Billy Smith was a fraud investigator with Verizon. A big part of his job was finding and shutting down suspicious phone activity. Billy Smith already helped the FBI take down the wrecking crew by testifying for the government and providing them with records and documents. So Matthew already had a bone to pick with Billy, but their beef was about to get personal. One day, Matthew picked up his phone and realized one of the phony accounts he was using to make calls was disconnected. After posing as a Verizon employee to get his phone turned back on, Matthew discovered that it was Billy Smith who disconnected his account. Matthew was furious. It was infuriating enough that Smith was working against him by aiding the FBI. Now he was messing with Matthew's phone. To retaliate, Matthew placed a number of harassing calls to Billy's house. He thought that it would scare him off, but Billy Smith wasn't the kind of person to back down. Not long after, Matthew woke up to realize his phone was blocked from calling certain numbers, making it impossible for him to run his scams. He instantly knew Billy Smith was behind it. It was more than Matthew could handle. His girlfriend, his community, his whole life, it all required unfeathered access to a phone. This meant war. First, he went after Billy's source of income. In April and May 2008, Matthew and his friends conspired to retaliate against Billy Smith by making telephone calls to Verizon and providing false information in an attempt to get him fired. Unfortunately, it didn't work. Billy kept his job and continued disrupting Matthew's illegal activities. So Matthew tried a different approach. He hacked Billy's phone and listened in on his conversations, looking for dirt he could use against him, but he got nothing. Matthew was running out of options. Frustrated and desperate, Matthew decided to do something he had never done before. He would go to Billy Smith's home personally and threaten him to back off. On May 18th, 2008, Matthew convinced his older brother and a friend to drive him to Billy Smith's home in New Hampshire. Since Matthew was blind, he obviously couldn't go alone. After about 1 hour of driving, they arrived at Billy Smith's home. As the car pulled up, Billy was outside on his lawn. Matthew walked up to Billy and introduced himself. This was the first time they were meeting face to face. Matthew told Smith he wasn't there to threaten or hurt him. He just wanted to persuade him to call off the investigation. A look of concern flashed across Smith's face. Then he told Matthew to wait while he went inside. As Billy Smith ran into the house, Matthew and his friends immediately realized what was happening. Smith was going in to call the police. Minutes later, police arrived at the scene. Matthew didn't try to run. He just stood there calm but defiant. In his mind, he was the victim. He told officers that Billy Smith had a vendetta against him, trying to paint himself like an innocent kid who had done nothing wrong. The police didn't buy it. They sent Matthew and his friends back to Boston, but his troubles were far from over. Billy Smith reported what happened to the FBI. Matthew was now officially wanted by the FBI. 2 weeks later, the FBI raided Matthew's home and arrested him. This time, there was no leniency. Matthew turned 18 just a month earlier, and now he was facing adult charges. In January 2009, Matthew pleaded guilty to 2 felony counts of conspiracy to commit fraud and intimidate a federal witness. A few months later, he was sentenced to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. At just 19 years old, Matthew was heading to federal prison, serving one of the longest sentences ever handed down for phone phreaking. But going to prison was the wake-up call Matthew needed. Locked in a small cell with nothing but time, he started to to rethink his choices and realized how foolish he acted. But instead of drowning in regret, he began to plan a different future. Matthew decided that when he got out, he would help people with disabilities. He said he wants to embrace his handicap and help others embrace theirs, to teach them to operate in the real world so maybe they won't have to create their own. After a decade behind bars, Matthew Wegman was released from prison on October 20th, 2018. There isn't much information online about what he's up to today, but let's hope he followed through on his decision to help others. Matthew Wegman's story is a powerful reminder of how loneliness can lead someone down the wrong path. Born blind, he faced struggles most of us will never understand, but he also allowed himself to be a victim of his struggles. Whatever challenges you're facing, remember this: you have the power to turn them into something that helps, not something that hurts. And my hope is that you'll choose to make the world a better place one day at a time. Visual Venture. If you guys like this video, check out my video on how a Boy Scout turned into a $1.2 billion drug lord right here. And then subscribe here. Thank you guys for everything. Peace.